June 5, 1944, 4:15 in the morning, Dwight Eisenhower stood in the doorway of Southwick House, staring at weather that could kill 150,000 men. The rain hammered down like it had a personal grudge. Wind tore across the English Channel at 30 miles per hour. Clouds sat so low you couldn't see 100 yards. This was the weather that would decide whether the largest invasion in human history happened at dawn, or whether Ike would have to tell 150,000 soldiers locked in ships that they were going back to port. Again, he'd already postponed once. 24 hours ago, he called it off, sent the whole damn armada back. Destroyers turned around mid-channel. Paratroopers who'd been psyched up for the jump sat back down in their planes, deflated like punctured tires. You could see it in their eyes. The weight was killing them worse than any German bullet would. Now here he was, for hours before dawn, facing the same damn question with worse damn weather. This wasn't just about weather reports and tide tables. This was about holding together an alliance that was fracturing under the weight of its own egos. This was about keeping Churchill from having a nervous breakdown. This was about preventing his ground commander from undermining the whole operation with doubt. This was about looking 150,000 young men in the eye and sending them to a beach where German machine guns were registered on every square foot of sand. Eisenhower had spent 3 years building toward this moment. 3 years of politics, planning, and compromise. 3 years of keeping Montgomery from destroying the alliance with his ego, keeping Patton from starting World War III on his own initiative, and keeping Churchill from second-guessing every decision out of terror that this would be another Gallipoli. Now it came down to weather, and one decision. His decision. Nobody could make it for him. Not Churchill, not Roosevelt, not Marshall. Just him. And the weather said wait. The weather said postpone. The weather said this is suicide. But the calendar said go. The tide said go. The moon said go. And most importantly, the Germans said go because they thought nobody would be crazy enough to invade in this weather. Eisenhower walked back into that room at Southwick House, looked at his commanders, and knew that whatever he decided in the next 5 minutes would echo through history. Go, and maybe win the war. Go, and maybe drown the invasion before it starts. Wait, and definitely lose the element of surprise. Wait, and definitely watch the alliance fall apart as soldiers and ships sat idle for weeks. This was it. The loneliest decision any man ever had to make. Let me tell you how he got there. Back in December 1943, Eisenhower got the call every general dreams about and dreads in equal measure. Roosevelt wanted him for Supreme Commander of Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion, the big show, the operation that would determine whether democracy survived or whether Hitler's fortress Europe stood forever. Eisenhower was in North Africa when the news came through. He just finished the Mediterranean campaign. Sicily, Italy, all of it. He knew what amphibious operations looked like when they went right, and he knew what they looked like when they went to hell. Now they wanted him to plan the largest amphibious operation in history. 5 divisions hitting the beaches simultaneously. Airborne drops behind enemy lines. Naval bombardment from battleships. Air superiority from thousands of aircraft. Logistics that would make the Normandy invasion of 1066 look like a Boy Scout camping trip. The first thing Eisenhower learned when he arrived in London in January 1944 was that everybody had an opinion, and most of them contradicted each other. Montgomery wanted a narrow front with concentrated force. Churchill wanted the invasion called off entirely and preferred operations in the Mediterranean or the Balkans. The British chiefs worried the whole thing was American recklessness that would lead to another Dunkirk. American generals thought the British were paralyzed by memories of World War I trenches. Patton wanted to be included. Bradley wanted clear command lines. The Navy wanted more ships. The Air Force wanted strategic bombing to continue. Everybody wanted something, and they all wanted it for Mike. The original Overlord plan called for a 3-division assault. Eisenhower took one look at it and knew it would fail. The front was too narrow. There wasn't enough manpower for breakthrough. If the Germans contained the beachhead, the whole invasion would bog down in another static front like Italy. Montgomery agreed with him on this, which was rare. Together they pushed for expansion to 5 divisions. The British and American chiefs approved it. Now the invasion front stretched from Utah Beach in the west to Sword Beach in the east. 50 miles of French coastline, 5 beaches, 2 American sectors, 3 British and Canadian sectors. Each beach had its own objectives, its own obstacles, its own German defenders. But expanding the plan meant expanding everything else. More landing craft, more ships, more supplies, more training, and most critically, more time. The original target date for Overlord was May 1st, 1944. Eisenhower pushed it to early June. He needed the extra time for landing craft production. He needed it for training. He needed it to stockpile supplies in England. Churchill hated the delay. Every week they waited was another week for the Germans to strengthen the Atlantic Wall. Then there was the matter of where to invade. The obvious choice was Pas-de-Calais. It was the shortest route across the Channel, only 20 miles from Dover. It was also the most heavily defended sector of the Atlantic Wall. The Germans knew it was obvious, too. They'd fortified Pas-de-Calais with their best divisions, their heaviest guns, their most extensive obstacles. The Allies chose Normandy instead. It was further from England. The crossing would take longer. The beaches were more exposed to Channel weather. But the German defenses were lighter. If they could achieve surprise, if they could get ashore before the Germans reacted, they might establish a beachhead before Rommel could bring up reinforcements. The key was making the Germans believe the invasion was coming at Pas-de-Calais. That's where Operation Fortitude came in. Fake armies, dummy tanks and aircraft, false radio traffic, double agents feeding German intelligence exactly what the Allies wanted them to believe. An entire Phantom Army group commanded by Patton, who the Germans considered the most dangerous Allied general. Fortitude had to work. If the Germans figured out the real target was Normandy, they'd move their panzer divisions from Pas-de-Calais to the invasion beaches. If those panzers hit the beachhead in the first 48 hours, before the Allies could get armor and artillery ashore, the invasion would fail. Simple as that. So Eisenhower needed surprise. He needed the Germans look in the wrong direction. He needed Rommel to keep his panzers away from Normandy until it was too late. But surprise depended on weather. Good weather would bring the invasion. Bad weather would delay it. And if they delayed too long, they'd lose the specific combination of tide, moon, and daylight that made the invasion possible. The requirements were specific and unforgiving. They needed low tide at dawn. Low tide would expose the German beach obstacles. Engineers could clear them before the main assault waves came in. Dawn would give the Navy enough light for naval gunfire support while still providing some darkness for the airborne drops. They needed a full moon the night before. The paratroopers needed moonlight to see their drop zones. Without it, they'd be scattered across Normandy with no idea where they were. They needed decent weather. Not perfect, just decent. Enough for the Navy to get across the Channel. Enough for the Air Force to provide cover. Enough for the landing craft to make it to the beaches without swamping. Those 3 requirements only aligned a few days each month. In June 1944, the windows were June 5th, 6th, and 7th. After that, they'd have to wait 2 weeks for the next favorable tide. 2 weeks with 150,000 men locked on ships. 2 weeks of lost surprise as the Germans figure out something big was brewing in southern England. Eisenhower set the invasion for June 5th, H hour at 6:30 a.m. Everything was ready. The ships were loaded. The men were briefed. The aircraft were fueled. The machinery of the invasion was in motion. Then Group Captain James Stagg walked into Eisenhower's headquarters with news that made everyone's blood run cold. Stagg was a Scottish meteorologist. Quiet guy, careful with his words, not the type to exaggerate or panic. When he spoke, people listened because he didn't waste time on nonsense. On June 3rd, Stagg told Eisenhower the weather was deteriorating. A low-pressure system was moving into the channel. Clouds, wind, rain. It would hit the invasion area on June 5th, right when the assault was scheduled to begin. Eisenhower asked him for specifics. Stagg gave them. Cloud ceiling would be below 1,000 feet. Naval gunfire observers wouldn't be able to spot targets. Air support would be impossible. Wind would be 15 to 25 miles per hour, with gusts higher. Landing craft would struggle. Waves would be 4 to 6 feet. Men would get seasick. Equipment would get wet. The whole thing would be a mess. Could the invasion proceed anyway? Technically, yes. The Navy could cross the channel. The landing craft could reach the beaches. But without air support, the assault would be much bloodier. Without naval gunfire observers, the bombardment would be less effective. The men would be cold, wet, and sick when they hit the beaches. Eisenhower looked at his subordinate commanders. Montgomery, the ground commander. Lee Mallory, the air commander. Ramsey, the naval commander. Tedder, his deputy. What did they think? Lee Mallory was emphatic. The air forces couldn't operate in that weather. The fighters couldn't provide cover. The bombers couldn't support the assault. The airborne operation would be a disaster. Paratroopers would be scattered across Normandy in the dark, in clouds, with no idea where they were. Gliders would crash. He recommended postponement. Ramsey was more measured. The Navy could get across. The bombardment could proceed, though it would be less accurate. The main concern was the landing craft. In heavy seas, they'd take on water. Some might swamp. Men might drown before they reached the beaches. But if Eisenhower ordered it, the Navy would go. Montgomery wanted to go. Weather be damned. The men were ready. The element of surprise wouldn't last forever. Every day they waited was another day for the Germans to figure things out. Go now, in bad weather, or risk losing surprise entirely. Tedder supported Lee Mallory. Air power was essential. Without it, the casualty rate would skyrocket. Better to wait for a proper weather window than to throw away lives unnecessarily. The room was split, 2 saying go, 2 saying wait, all looking at Eisenhower for the decision. Eisenhower thought about what Stagg was telling him. This wasn't marginal weather. This was bad weather. Not the worst possible, but bad enough to matter. Bad enough to cost lives unnecessarily. He made the call. The invasion was postponed 24 hours. The order went out at 5 a.m. on June 4th. Turn the ships around. The invasion scheduled for June 5th was off. They'd reconvene that evening to assess the weather for June 6th. Eisenhower knew what that postponement cost. Surprise was degraded. Security was compromised. Every additional day increased the risk that the Germans would figure out the invasion was imminent. And the men who'd been psyched up for battle, were now deflated, uncertain, waiting again. But sending them into a storm would cost more. So they waited, and Eisenhower spent June 4th carrying the weight of a decision he hadn't finished making. Because June 6th might not be better. June 6th might be worse. And if it was, he'd have to postpone again. 2 weeks. Maybe more. Maybe the invasion wouldn't happen at all in June. That evening, at 9:30 p.m. on June 4th, Eisenhower's commanders gathered again at Southwick House. The rain hammered the windows. Wind screamed around the building. Outside, the channel was in chaos. This was the weather that had forced the postponement. Stagg walked in looking like he'd found something interesting. He had an update. The low-pressure system would pass through faster than initially predicted. Behind it, there would be a break. Not a long break. Maybe 36 hours. Enough for the invasion to launch, for the initial waves to get ashore, for the beachhead to be established. After that, the weather would deteriorate again, but there would be a window. June 6th, a narrow window, but a window nonetheless. Eisenhower asked him the critical question. How confident was he in this forecast? Weather prediction wasn't exact science. Forecasts could be wrong. Stagg didn't hedge. He was reasonably confident. Not certain, but reasonably confident. The weather on June 6th would be marginal. Not good, but better than June 5th. Better than waiting 2 weeks. Marginal. That was the word that stuck in everyone's mind. Not good, not bad, marginal. Lee Mallory was still skeptical. The Air Forces would be limited. The airborne operation was still risky. But if this was the only window, maybe they had no choice. Ramsey thought the Navy could work with marginal weather. It wouldn't be pleasant, but it was doable. Montgomery was unequivocal. Go. The men were ready. This was their window. Take it. Tedder supported going, but with reservations. Marginal weather meant marginal air support. That meant higher casualties. But waiting 2 weeks might mean no surprise at all. Once again, the room was looking at Eisenhower. For senior commanders had given their input. Now he had to decide. Go on June 6th in marginal weather, or postpone 2 weeks and risk everything. Eisenhower said he needed to think about it. They reconvened at 4:15 a.m. on June 5th for final decision. That would give them just enough time to launch the invasion at dawn on June 6th if he gave the order, or enough time to postpone again if he didn't. He dismissed his commanders and spent the night alone with the weight of 150,000 lives. Let me tell you what Eisenhower was thinking about that night, because it wasn't just weather. He was thinking about the men, not abstract numbers. Actual young men with faces and names and families back home. Men who'd been training for this moment for months. Men who trusted him to make the right decision. Men who would die if he got it wrong. He was thinking about the casualties. The planners had estimated 10,000 casualties on D-Day. 10,000 young men dead, wounded, or missing in one day. That was the optimistic estimate. If things went badly, if the Germans reacted faster than expected, if the beach obstacles weren't cleared, if the naval bombardment wasn't effective, the casualties could be double that. 20,000 in one day. More than the entire Revolutionary War. He was thinking about failure. What happened if the invasion failed? If the Germans threw them back into the sea? The Allies didn't have enough resources for a second attempt in 1944. Maybe not in 1945 either. The invasion would be postponed indefinitely. The Russians would be left fighting Germany alone on the Eastern Front. The alliance would fracture. The war might drag on for years. He was thinking about Churchill. The Prime Minister was terrified of another Gallipoli. In World War I, Churchill had pushed for an amphibious operation against the Turks at Gallipoli. It had failed catastrophically. Thousands of British and Commonwealth soldiers died on Turkish beaches. Churchill's political career nearly ended. He'd carried that failure for 30 years. Now he was watching another amphibious operation, 10 times larger, and he was convinced it would fail the same way. Churchill had been second-guessing Overlord from the beginning. He'd pushed for operations in the Mediterranean, in the Balkans, anywhere except the cross-channel invasion. He'd been overruled by Roosevelt and the American chiefs. But his doubt remained. Eisenhower knew Churchill was expecting disaster. He was thinking about the Germans. Rommel had spent months fortifying the Atlantic Wall. Millions of mines. Thousands of beach obstacles. Artillery registered on every landing zone. Machine guns in concrete bunkers. And behind the beaches, panzer divisions waiting to counterattack. The Germans knew the invasion was coming. They just didn't know where or when. If Eisenhower tipped them off by waiting too long, those panzer divisions would be waiting on the beaches when the first landing craft came in. He was thinking about the Russians. Stalin had been demanding a second front for 2 years. Every month the Allies delayed was another month of Soviet soldiers dying on the Eastern Front. Stalin didn't trust his Western allies. He thought they were deliberately stalling, letting Russia bleed while they waited for both Germany and the Soviet Union to exhaust themselves. Overlord was a promise that the Western allies would finally commit. If it failed, or if it was postponed indefinitely, Stalin might make a separate peace with Hitler. The alliance would collapse. He was thinking about Montgomery. His ground commander was confident the invasion would succeed. Monty had planned every detail. He had backup plans for the backup plans. He believed the training was adequate. The force was sufficient. The plan was sound. But Monty had been wrong before. Market Garden would prove that later. And Monty's confidence sometimes blinded him to risks. He was thinking about the airborne operation. 2 American divisions and 1 British division would drop behind the beaches the night before the invasion. Their job was to secure key objectives: bridges, causeways, road junctions, things the ground forces would need once they broke out of the beachhead. But airborne operations were inherently risky. Paratroopers would be scattered. Some would land in the wrong place. Some would be captured or killed before they could organize. Gliders would crash. In good weather, the airborne operation was risky. In marginal weather, with clouds and wind, it could be a catastrophe. Lee Mallory had told Eisenhower privately that he expected 70% casualties among the airborne forces. 70%. That was over 15,000 men, dead or captured before the beach landings even started. Lee Mallory had recommended canceling the airborne operation entirely. Eisenhower had overruled him. The airborne drops were essential. Without them, the beach forces wouldn't be able to advance inland. The beachhead would be contained. But that meant Eisenhower was sending those men to near certain death. He was thinking about Stagg's forecast. Marginal weather. What did that actually mean? Would the cloud ceiling be 800 feet or 1,200 feet? Would the wind be 15 miles per hour or 25? Would the waves be 4 feet or 6? Those differences mattered. They mattered a lot, and Stagg couldn't tell him exactly. Nobody could. Weather forecasting in 1944 wasn't precise. It was educated guessing based on incomplete data. But most of all, he was thinking about one simple fact. This decision was his alone. Looking back, Eisenhower's decision to launch the invasion on June 6, 1944, despite marginal weather, was the right call. But it wasn't obvious at the time. It required courage to overrule the pessimists. It required judgment to interpret Stagg's forecast correctly. It required trust in his subordinate commanders and his troops. And it required a willingness to accept responsibility if everything went wrong. That night at Southwick House, at 4:15 a.m. on June 5, 1944, when Eisenhower said, "Okay, we'll go," he made the loneliest decision of the war. No one could make it for him. No one could share the responsibility. It was his call and his alone. He later said that those 5 words were the hardest he ever spoke. Harder than accepting German surrender. Harder than any decision he made as president, because those 5 words sent 150,000 men into battle, knowing thousands wouldn't come home. But those 5 words also liberated Europe. They broke the back of Nazi Germany. They vindicated democracy and freedom. They proved that free people, working together despite their differences, could defeat tyranny. The success of D-Day wasn't inevitable. It depended on weather forecasts that might have been wrong. It depended on German mistakes and Allied luck. It depended on the courage of young men who waded through the surf under machine gun fire because their commanders asked them to. But most of all, it depended on one man's willingness to make a decision when no one else could, to accept the responsibility, to carry the weight, to say yes when everyone else was saying maybe. That was leadership. That was command. That was Dwight Eisenhower on the night. He gave the order that launched D-Day. The night the weather was wrong, the risks were enormous, and one man had to decide whether 150,000 soldiers would go to war or go back to port. He chose war. He chose risk. He chose to trust his troops and his judgment over his fears. And because of that decision, made in a rainstorm at 4:15 in the morning, the world changed. The beaches of Normandy ran red with blood on June 6, 1944. But by sunset, the Atlantic Wall was breached. The beachhead was secured. The liberation of Europe had begun, all because one man said 5 words. "Okay, we'll go." That's the story of the night Eisenhower gave the order. The Supreme Command decision that launched D-Day. The loneliest decision any man ever had to make. The decision that changed everything.